Hi, this is Tracey Tokuhama-Espinosa, and this is week 10 on attention, one of these huge cornerstones of learning. To work through today's information in an orderly way, we're going to divide it up into the core concepts of vocabulary, some key words you're going to need to know for all of the readings within this section, and then this larger idea, is the combination of attention and memory equal to learning? How true is that? And how vital is attention to learning? And then finally, we're going to look at attention in the brain. So as far as vocabulary is concerned, we want to look at attention as saliency from a perception perspective, selective attention, attention continuum from going from being bored to high stress, attention bias, why is it that people pay attention to things that are scary more than things that are pleasant. We will not be looking at ADHD in this video. We will have a special section on this though. I hope you can join us on that. Then we will look at attention spans, how long can a human being pay attention, and has that changed due to technology? Then we'll look at attention networks as they exist according to Posner and Rothbard's model, and then attention blindness. So we'll now consider each of these points individually. So attention as saliency, the word salient is something that sort of stands out, jumps out. And according to E.T. Koch and Niebuhr's work, they see that this model works at least in visual attention related to color, intensity, and orientation, where things are located or how bright or contrast of colors things are, or how intense they are presented compared with the context in which they're seen. So when you look at the neural correlates of this, it's very, very interesting because the anterior insula is involved in attention and looking at attention for saliency, but the anterior insula is also very involved in considering self-related cognition or consciousness. So it's really fascinating to see that there's this dynamic interaction between what is externally oriented attention, how I pay attention to the world outside of me, but then also how is it that I feel about different things. So the same key hub, the anterior insula, is very important for both of those networks. And we can see these things when we talk about saliency, when things jump out at you, either by the type of typeface or how things are contrasted or the use of color, or even, for example, in a visual format of layout, how people lay out design, how they help your eye follow in one direction or another. So there's a ton of information in the visual field. But could it be true that there's saliency in terms of sound? Absolutely, right? If you hear a loud clapping noise and you turn and your attention is drawn to something because it's a sound, yes. Pungent smells, yes, of course. Touch, taste, all of those things can also contribute to saliency. So the idea here is that it's sense perception relative to normal context. So what actually jumps out and has special importance by the contrast that exists within the environment. And there's a question as to whether there's such a thing as a saliency hierarchy. And this idea is really grounded in that what we know is the norm, right? And what is new or different, what stands out, is more salient. So the things that are different are the things that we will pay more attention to. And there's a lot of research that's been done in psychology that shows that babies, when they hear a foreign language, will actually stop suckling because it's different from what they're used to hearing. Isn't that interesting? Also, smell of the mother's milk. If they've been suckled by somebody other than the mom, the sense of smell, when it's different, they'll stop, right? Same thing, the taste. So we know that all sensory perception has a level of saliency to it. I don't know how many of you grew up as I did with Sesame Street, but there was this song, one of these things is not like the other, and you have to find it before my song is done. That was a Big Bird thing, right? But you're taught from very young, or you're taught to identify, because this is a natural state of the brain to look for things that are different, but being able to categorize and understand how things are similar and how things are different is part of the core of learning. So one thing that has been by far much more studied than any other area has to do with saliency related to visual perception. There are lots of studies, but not nearly as many related to auditory perception, taste, smell, and touch. So while saliency does exist in all sense perceptions, it's an intelligent speculation, though I don't have any evidence for this, that the occipital lobe is much larger than other parts of the brain, so that main hub for visualization is larger in humans than other things, than, for example, sight or smell. So it could be possible that humans rely heavily on the visual sense to be able to perceive and understand the world, and that also differences are highlighted more through the visual field. And we do this primarily through pattern recognition and also through novelty. So patterns can be, the way that people who go to football matches sort of do this tribal face painting all over the world, or it could be a pattern that you see in music, for example, written music, or patterns that you see in nature, or perception patterns of how things taste. For example, how is rice in one culture the same or different as it is in other cultures? But human brains seek out those patterns, and in fact that is one of the core ways that we learn, is to identify what is similar, what is something close to what I already know. In contrast to that, the human brain is also in parallel really looking for novelty. What are the things that are slightly different that stand out? And again, I love Sesame Street. They have 45 years of great research as to why things work out, and they expanded this. It's not just very clear things like that size of the bowl we saw on the previous slide, and not only between Muppets and real animals, but also they went into this field of trying to see, could kids understand the abstract? None of these represents anything concrete, but one of them is different, isn't it? Slightly different. So could kids see that? And this really hones into something quite spectacular and quite sad. Remember we talked about plasticity not always being something good. Well, your brain adapts to what it does most. So if you only are used to seeing people of a certain race, for example, when you see people of a different race, automatically, sensors go up, saliency, this is different. And things that are different are automatically categorized as scary until we can recategorize them based on something else that we already know. So unfortunately, racism is a natural attribute of the brain, to be afraid of things that you're not used to seeing. And this is also shown in many sociological studies. Kids who are brought up in multiracial or multi-ethnic environments are far less racist than people who are born in just a single race communities. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears to looking at selective attention. This is different from saliency, right? Now, selective attention, many of you might have seen this video before. If you have, don't say anything, just watch.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris and is copyrighted. It is available for use in talks, training, and
So if you've already seen that, you already need to look for the gorilla. But I'm going to do something a little bit harder here and see if this one catches you. But think about this now. Why is it that the gorilla walking through there was just, you were blind to seeing that? Think about that as we look at this next example.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
That's right, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Well, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
Okay, so the big idea here is that we don't see things unless we're really looking for them. And can be really, really difficult. Think in all kinds of contexts. This video was actually made to make people aware, people who are driving, make them aware of cyclists, because you're not used to thinking about cyclists on the road, you're thinking about cars and whatever. But this is also true in educational contexts, for example. You can have kids who are just, they might be focused on something and they think that's important, but unless you call out and say, hello, no, it's this that's really important, people can pay attention to the wrong things just because they're not looking for it. This has to do with becoming not only aware but alert to different details that can occur as they relate to our selective attention. There's additional videos like this in the bundle. I hope you'll take the time to have a look at some of those because they're really quite amazing what we can do. And there's a lot of explanation, for example, how magic works based on this. Okay, so let's switch now to a new idea, another idea related to attention. Attention as a means of connection to other people. How is it that being mindful, remember we've talked about this a lot in class, is a form of attention that allows us to then have connections to other human beings? Let's have a look at this video. So those of you who are interested in this topic, not only in addictions, but also just being mindful, and what does that mean related to attention? And also he goes on in the rest of the video to talk about real connectivity between other people. What does it mean to put that humanity back into interactions, relations, the classroom? How do you actually make those connections by simply paying attention to the signals that other people are sending you? So this is attention described as a means to connection. Now if we ask ourselves, and get back to this other big idea then, is attention plus memory equal to learning? Well, we have to come to some conclusions that, well, it's this oversimplified kind of a formula, but it's really clear that without memory or without attention, there is no learning. But what's spectacular to note is that your mind is always paying attention. It just might not be what's appropriate for that moment, right? So the kid who might be sitting in your class and sort of like spaced out looking out the window and enjoying himself is paying attention, right? This guy is paying attention. He's looking for something, thinking about something, remembering something. So attention mechanisms, like your senses. Remember we said that there's not a lot of stock to be put into learning styles because you cannot turn off any sensory mode. Well, in a similar way, for survival, you cannot turn off attention. Attention is always working. The difficulty is when we talk about this spectrum of attention spans, from going from a very low level of attention, right, nearly being asleep, or very passive, to being in high alert or almost stressed. So when you have this big continuum here, where are you on the continuum to be able to learn at your optimal source? So if we look at the brain, we look at different types of attention mechanism. There's a wonderful summary that's done here by the University of Oregon that I'd like to share.
Attention is important in almost everything we do, from tying a shoelace to learning to read or even crossing the street. Without the ability to pay attention, our world would be a jumble of images and sounds. Try this experiment. On the screen, there is an image. Pay close attention as it flickers. Do you notice anything changing? Now, look at the lower left corner of the screen. You should see a man's pants changing colors. In this case, your brain wasn't aware of the color change until you directed your attention to the right location. Now imagine what it's like for a child in a classroom.
Is everyone doing okay? Yeah.
If Jane's attention is not focused in the right place, she can be completely unaware of important instructions or information. When Jane focuses her attention on something specific, her brain produces a bigger response to what she is focusing on. Attention actually changes how her brain responds. While we typically think of attention as a single thing, there are actually different kinds of attention. These different kinds of attention are associated with different brain areas, use different chemicals, and develop at different times in our lives. These three aspects of attention include orienting our attention, maintaining our attention, and controlling or regulating our attention. One of the earliest attention skills to develop is the ability to orient or move attention from one thing to another. One of the brain areas most involved in this is the parietal lobe. This aspect of attention is not developed at the time of birth. In fact, newborns have particular difficulty orienting their attention during the first 4 months of life. During this time, when a child is distressed, her attention is difficult to redirect. However, parents and caretakers should not be alarmed. This stage of attention development is completely normal. To ease their growing pains, newborns should be held and gently rocked so that their distress can peacefully subside. Shaking toys or stuffed animals won't work, as their attention can't be distracted or forced into compliance. However, in a few months, as this skill develops, caregivers will notice that they can soothe their children in different ways. During the first few years of life, a different attention skill is beginning to develop: the ability to stay awake and alert, which is regulated by structures deep inside the brain, as well as frontal and parietal areas of the cortex. These areas of the brain mature and adapt as young children develop healthy patterns of wakefulness and rest. The normal development of these patterns will help infants sleep through the night, as well as stay alert for longer periods of time while awake. As children get older, they will gain the ability to sustain their attention for longer and longer amounts of time. This aspect of attention continues to develop at least through 10 years of age. Finally, the third type of attention is the ability to regulate attention and control impulses. When children are around 2 years of age, they experience what could be considered a mismatch in development. Their motor and language skills allow them to move, talk, and interact, but their ability to regulate their attention is just beginning to emerge. Parents are familiar with the inconsolable frustration, crying, thrashing, and yelling typical of children of this age. This is why some people label the toddler years the terrible twos. However, the word terrible is somewhat misleading, as this is a completely natural phase of development. During this time, children are beginning to use their attention to develop patience, to control their emotions, and to direct their focus. During this relatively short period of time, it is important for parents and teachers to treat children with patience and understanding while they struggle with this ability. When a child has an outburst, try not to respond with anger. Instead, check with your child about the emotions and feelings behind the outburst. If your child is too upset to talk, you may need to allow a cooling off period. Make sure she is physically safe, and after your child has calmed down, a conversation can begin. The most extreme displays of the terrible twos usually dissipate by the time a child is 4 years old. Many aspects of attention actually continue to develop into the second decade of life. But you might be wondering, if all these behaviors are normal, how do I know if my child has an attention deficit? The media bombards us with so many conflicting stories about attention problems in children that it's hard to separate myth from fact. Let's take a look at the facts. Right now, between 3 and 5% of children in the United States are diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. An ADHD diagnosis is based on observing specific behaviors in children, for example, the inability to sit still, or difficulty ignoring distractions. But, as we saw earlier, all children show these symptoms to some degree. What sets ADHD apart is that the symptoms are persistent and occur in multiple settings, school and home, for example. And it's important to realize that even though a child can sustain his attention while watching a movie or playing video games, he might still have difficulty controlling his attention in other settings. If you suspect a child may have ADHD, It is important to open the lines of communication between parents and teachers, as well as between different teachers at a child's school.
Hi, Mrs. Charney. This is Michelle Griffin, Ashley's homeroom teacher.
Also, try to determine whether she is inattentive only during certain activities, such as reading or math. This is important, as sometimes a child's difficulty is specific to reading or math, but can be confused for a general attention deficit. If you still think that your child might have ADHD, talk to your doctor or school psychologist so that your child can get the appropriate care.
It's very easy for us as adults to form unrealistic expectations for what a young child's attention skills should look like. It's important to remember that things that bother us, crying, late night awakenings, even temper tantrums, are actually a normal part of every child's attention development. That said, parents and caregivers can also consider ways to support a child's developing attention skills.
When newborns are distressed, hold and rock them gently, allowing plenty of time for their distress to be soothed. Maintain regular bedtimes to help children develop normal sleep schedules. If a child has trouble focusing in school, ask if she can be moved to the front of the classroom where distractions may be less likely. Observe their attention skills in different social settings and their engagement in different activities. Talk to the child, teachers, and parents to discover how she's developing. Finally, provide children with opportunities to make the most of their developing attention skills. Be creative. Introduce activities that allow children to pay attention for longer periods of time, to control their bodies and behaviors, and to notice small details in the world around them. Infants don't come into the world ready to sit still and listen. They need time to develop these abilities. When infants and children are given the time, opportunity, and environment for attention to develop, they'll be developing a set of skills that they will use to help them learn throughout their lives. Being patient and supportive is a powerful way to encourage children's attention and learning.
And just to reiterate, the vocabulary used in this particular video to talk about these different attention systems, they talked about three systems, right? The orienting system, the maintenance system, and these regulating, self-regulating systems of deciding what's important. So, given those three that were mentioned in the video, right, these are attention systems, right? Let's look at some other models of attention systems and try to identify what hubs do those networks really pass through frequently. And then also look at this big idea of how is attention related to consciousness. So as far as the anatomy of attentional networks, let's just look at a few minutes of, to me, the grand guru of attention studies. This is Michael Posner, who has spent his whole life, really, his whole professional life, looking at questions of attention. And let's see how he describes them. And if you'll note in the video, he's going to tell you how he evolved in his thinking of and labeling of these different parts of the brain after technology actually evolved to catch up with this. So let's have a look at a few minutes of this interview.
And over time, I began to get interested in the problem of the selection of information for conscious experience. And I spent a lot of time trying to localize in time the exact time when people would become aware of the sensory message. It's an approach a lot of people have taken over the years.
So you've theorized on the three different components of attention. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, during the time of the information processing approach, I tried to distinguish between three aspects of attention, one of them being alertness, a second one being selection, and the third one being conscious processing. And I still have three components, but they've changed rather dramatically, mostly because of our ability to understand some of the anatomy behind these various attentional functions. And once we understood some of the anatomy, then that dictated a different way of thinking about the problem of attention, although maybe by coincidence or maybe just because I'm not too flexible. There's still three components. I call them alerting, same as before, and then orienting, having to deal with the selection of information from external sources. And I always distinguish between the place where attention can have its effect. Obviously, if it's a visual information, it has its effect in the visual system, and the source of that effect. Turns out that regardless of which modality you're selecting, whether it be visual, auditory, somatosensory, and so on, the anatomy of the source of that attentional effect is pretty much the same. And that turned out to be a big surprise to us and allowed me to think about an orienting system, which has been studied probably more than any other aspect of attention because it's so common between humans and non-human primates. And so their work using fMRI, for example, in humans, but also non-human primate work using cellular recording, for example. So orienting has probably been the best studied, and often attention is associated only with dealing with sensory signals. But of course, you know, we attend to our own thoughts, and we attend to memories that we have. And we were able to find that there is a higher level attention system, which I've called the executive attention system, whose purpose is to regulate information from other systems. So if you attend to an external source of information, that executive system will be coupled or connected to, let's say, the visual or auditory system. But if you are dealing with regulating an emotion, for example, trying to be less fearful when you're giving a public talk, then it might be coupled to a limbic structure like the amygdala. And so this has become the higher level process of attention, which is involved in what we might call self-control or self-regulation.
Okay. So you were talking a little bit about where these, that the executive processes are going on in a certain central area of the brain, or a single area of the brain.
Not a single area.
Not a single area.
What we see with methods that have been developed, like fMRI, is that there's always a network of areas, usually widely scattered, not right next to each other, but a network of areas scattered around the brain that are the source of this particular effect. And for this executive attention network, the most important areas seem to be the anterior cingulate gyrus, right at the midline of the frontal lobe, and then the anterior insula, which is more lateral in frontal areas, and then parts of the basal ganglia. And these work together in ways that we really don't understand in detail to regulate the activity that's going on in other networks. So when there's competition, when you try to, let's say, stick to a main line or goal in the presence of distractions and so on, then this area allows the priority to be given to the selected information, to the information that's fulfilling your goal. And therefore, it's obviously a very important area to study and understand, and there have been some progress in our understanding it.
So if these connected areas are sort of how you select and process information, would you think that that's where sort of consciousness resides in the brain, or do you believe this is independent?
Well, as I say, it's a network of areas, and it does play a role in some aspects of consciousness for sure. The way I think about it is that it's very important for what we might call focal consciousness, the thing that you're really concentrating on. If you're in a complicated big room with lots of activity going on, you have general ambient awareness of the whole scene. And you might think you know about what's going on every place, but in fact, you only really have good awareness of some focal area on which you're concentrating. And this attentional network that I've described, this executive attention network, seems to be very important in the control of that focal aspect of consciousness. It's also very important in another thing that we call conscious, namely voluntary action. So when a stimulus occurs, I might decide to move toward it or move away from it and so on. And that decision is implemented or involves the activity of this executive attention network. So yes, it plays a very important role in consciousness, although there may be aspects of consciousness which are not involving this network.
So one thing really fascinating about Michael Posner's work is that he has continued to evolve his theory over time. The last mention there was about this attention blindness. Remember the video we just saw about the gorilla, right? This has to do with not being able to see things that seem so obvious, but just because you're not paying attention to that specifically. In summary, he pointed out to these alerting systems, the orienting system, and the executive system. We want to turn specifically now to look at these ideas of the executive system because they have a lot to do with the study that we mentioned before about the integration of external stimuli, what you pay attention to that comes to you from the outside, and how that's interpreted inside your head to actually create what is called consciousness. So we'll revisit that in just a few minutes. So to sum up Posner's systems, he talked about this alerting network, the orientation network, and the executive network, and he identified key hubs in the brain through which those networks actually occur. And he spent many years on this, and he's had a paper out in 2012 that was revisiting really 20 years of documenting these attention systems and sort of reviewing and rethinking their own presumptions or their own findings based on changes in technology, how we are now able to see the brain do different types of things. The most recent things that Michael Posner has been working on, he's a fascinating guy and very accessible, but he's really looking at the establishment of different white matter tracks as evidence of new learning, especially as they relate to attention networks. So if you're interested in his work, he's at the University of Oregon as well, and you should have a look at what he's doing. He's doing some spectacular work there. Okay, so now let's turn to this idea of roadblocks. And if you recall in some of the other videos, they were already talking about how attention networks can be compromised with things like basic physiology. If you haven't slept well or if you haven't eaten well, how does that influence your attention span? And this bigger idea of stress, how can stress influence attention? Well, the research shows there's clear evidence, and I think all of us can, are living testimony to that. Sleep is directly correlated to attention networks, and so lack of sleep doesn't permit us to be able to focus attention. We also know that lack of dreaming doesn't allow us to consolidate memories. We'll look at that next week. But the key idea here is this was this terrible, I'm not sure how ethical, this experiment where they reduced the amount of sleep that individuals were permitted to have, and to see where is this real cutoff point where when you sacrifice sleep at night, how does that compromise your ability to pay attention during consciousness during daytime? And so there's a key points where your sleep deprivation or lack of sleep or lower amounts of sleep over a certain amount of time, there's a direct curve that is intuitive. We would have guessed these curves to actually occur, but total lack of sleep deprivation, like just not going to sleep at all, obviously, and for a short amount of time, that can really throw you off the next day, of course, right? However, what they also found is that having less than, and they see this period to be more or less for the average person who might averagely get 8 hours of sleep if they were reduced by 2 hours. So let's just say your average amount of sleep is 6 hours. Well, maybe this would be reducing it to less, to 4 or 5 or whatever. But reducing what the average intake of sleep would be by 2 hours actually gets into this dangerous field. So their conclusions are that, sleep reduction, based on what a normal person's sleep pattern is, if they reduce it by what is the equivalent of about 20% of their normal sleep, that would lead to attention problems in that individual. This is connected to, but it's a different concept if you look at stress and attention. So obviously if you have less sleep, you would also have poorer emotional regulation. Well, we find that stress actually also puts a big toll in general on your emotional regulation as well. So they share common consequences. Lack of sleep and high stress situations do put a toll on emotional regulation, being able to keep your feelings in check. The increased release of cortisol in the brain also disturbs both memory as well as attention networks. So attention networks are compromised because of high stress situations. But what's interesting to see is that selective attention actually increases under stress. So the direct quote here is that selectivity to the task relevant attribute improves under stress. So when you're high stress and you're driving and I have to find the hospital, and boom, you're totally focused on the hospital, your attention networks related to let's find the hospital are on high alert, and those are highly focused, okay? But you're oblivious to everything else. So it's very much that selective attention, the choice, when you've decided that this is the most important thing, you will narrow in on that if you're highly stressed. But your general attention networks are compromised. And this is very interesting. In Cornell, they passed this out to their incoming students to try to help them understand, a little bit of stress is good, but let's find your optimal point. What is really, what gets you to peak performance? So having enough stress, or being in a classroom situation where you're not asleep, okay, where you are, have your curiosity peaked enough, or when you're in, a state of arousal where you are totally alert, that is fabulous. But if you continue to have this high state of alert, that actually results in stress, and so your performance is impaired. It goes down at that point. So this curve related to, this is good stress, this is eustress. We talked about this before when we talked about emotion. And this is, high anxiety. When you have stress and anxiety, you do not perform well. You cannot learn at your best. So the key here is, though, they don't put markers here, and they don't tell you what this means, because individuals will have different points of peak arousal where they are alert and focused. So as it is so highly individual, you can have general human parameters. There's certain things that highly stress people a long time, like being in high danger situations over several days puts everybody into high stress situations. We know that there's some extremes, right? But where your sweet spot is kind of individual. And this is why different people, when we asked you at the very beginning of the year, think of when it is that you learn best, you had such a variety of answers. As you saw before, Posner's work is looking at trying to understand where is this exchange between external attention to the world and internal review of oneself. And this study by Cohen and Kavanaugh, Chen and Nakayama, it's almost borders on almost philosophical, but their thinking is that representation of the relationship between attention and consciousness is expressed by a model in which information can only reach conscious awareness if somebody pays attention to it. So the idea of developing consciousness is when you are aware, or if you have paid attention to an external stimulus. So they have this model where they presume that that occurs. But then they also know in reality, not all attended items are going to reach awareness. So just paying attention does not guarantee that something gets into consciousness, right? So it is possible for attention to operate or be drawn towards a stimulus without that stimulus being consciously perceived. So awareness doesn't necessarily equal consciousness, okay? And then they also acknowledge that there's some things that you don't think that you have attended to, nor are you aware of, but they can also get in there, they can create neuronal activation, and they can create connections which may eventually lead to a sense of consciousness. So they were trying to sort of test this idea that Posner is saying, look, there's these networks here that you receive external stimuli, and you're also having to negotiate that with what are your prior experiences, your all understanding of yourself. And through these executive attention networks, come to some decisions of how things are prioritized, but also this is how you know who you are in this sense. In looking at this particular model, though, they were saying it's not necessarily true, because some things that you know unconsciously are also part of who you become at a conscious level. So borders kind of on the philosophical, which I love about neuroscience, is that we have all these gray areas still left to explore. So these authors are really just exploring what is the relationship then between attention, awareness, self-awareness, and then also the level of consciousness. Okay, last but not least, the goody-goody one. Remember we talked about the myth of multitasking, and some of you are still skeptics on this. Let's see what you think after you watch this video.
Turns out that multitasking is a myth. We think that we're doing a whole bunch of things at once, but we're not actually, because the brain doesn't work that way. And a number of studies now have shown from Earl Miller's lab at MIT and others, that what we're really doing is we're paying attention to one thing for a little bit of time, and then another, and then another, and then we come back round to the first. And all of these are separate projects that are occurring in separate parts of the brain. They require a separate start time, a separate monitoring process, And you end up fractionating your attention into little bits and pieces, not really engaging fully in any one thing. All that switching across tasks comes with a neurobiological cost. It depletes resources. So after an hour or two of attempting to multitask, if we find that we're tired and we can't focus, it's because those very neurochemicals we needed to focus are now gone. There are some jobs that require not multitasking because we know it doesn't exist, but this kind of rapid switching. I'm air traffic controller, simultaneous translator at the UN, journalists, monitoring all these different things at once. And we can take a tip from the air traffic controllers who, as part of their duty cycle, are required after every hour and a half or 2 hours of work, it's mandated that they take a 15 to 30-minute break. And that means an unplugged, disconnected break where they go for a walk or they listen to music, they exercise, something to restore all of the burned up neurochemicals. You might ask, during this period of our evolution when there's all this information, is the brain adapting and changing? And yes, it is. The brain adapts and changes all the time. Evolution is happening all the time. Unfortunately, it's rather sluggish. We talk about it in terms of evolutionary lag, and generally speaking, it takes about 20,000 years for the brain to catch up with the way the environment is, and in terms of how it's encoded in the genome. So 20,000 years from now, our brains may have evolved to deal with it. In the meantime, we have to employ strategies, just a little bit more self-discipline than we currently use, to filter out unwanted or unnecessary input. I'm not talking about never letting something frivolous or fun in, but I'm talking about adopting a kind of a habit of allowing yourself to focus on one thing at a time for at least a few hours a day.
Now, I think that was pretty convincing. If you're not 100% convinced, I want to share another aspect of this that has a lot to do with new technology. And I want to see if you recognize yourself in any of these scenarios that Dr. Ali Matu presents here.
Has this happened to you?
I'm really glad we get to spend a nice, quiet meal together tonight.
I know it's like really rare to just like sit down and just concentrate on us, but I'm really like it when we
Do you have to get on your phone again? Do you have to respond to every noise it makes?
This might be something important. I gotta like, it could be like work related. Hold on.
I'm sure it's just another tweet.
Well, but like, I mean, what?
Technology has completely changed how we interact with each other, our work, and ourselves. We're bombarded with 5 times as much information as we were in the 80s. It pulls us in through immediate notifications, and people expect immediate responses no matter where you are and what you're doing. Most of us cope by multitasking, doing 2 things at once. We keep our email open when we work on our documents, continue texting with one group of friends when we're hanging out with another, and scroll through our Twitter when we're watching Netflix. Here's the thing though, humans can't multitask. Now, if we're doing 2 different things at the same time, and one of them is something we've done a bunch of times, we can sort of multitask, like driving your daily commute and listening to music. But the moment one of those tasks gets difficult, like driving in a new part of town or trying to find a parking spot, you're gonna have to turn off the music. When people think they're multitasking, I'm doing my homework and watching TV.
Wait, who did you just give it to?
What they're actually doing is quickly switching from one thing to another. Try watching both of these videos at the same time. This isn't multitasking, it's called task switching, and it makes you dumb. Most people think they're really good at multitasking, but when psychologists studied this in the lab, they found that people make 20% more mistakes when multitasking. Not only are you doing a worse job when you multitask, but it also takes a lot longer to get things done. And the more you multitask, the harder it becomes to recover from distractions. Your brain is built to do one thing at one time, and even that takes effort. The default setting on your brain is daydreaming mode. This is where your thoughts wander from one thing to another. But focused attention is a super complex task. You have to filter out distractions in your environment, ignore those thoughts about doing something more interesting, remember important information, make decisions about what to do, and solve problems as they come up. All this work is really exhausting for your brain. And after a while, your brain needs to switch back to daydreaming mode in order to recharge. Pro tip, every couple of hours, take a break from your work and daydream. Just let your mind wander as you go on a walk or look out a window, listen to music. And no, you can't read your email or check social media while doing this. Stuff like that triggers focused attention and undoes your daydreaming recharge. This is why I hate open offices. While they make employees feel more connected, all those distractions have been found to hurt attention spans, productivity, creativity, and lead to more stress. Open offices take away control from your environment. When you can't control your environment and limit distractions, your attention is going to suffer and you're going to do a bad job. The most important skill you need to learn to be productive is to concentrate on one thing at one time. Learning how to pick a task, embracing it fully, silencing your phone and putting it away, closing all the other tabs on your browser, shutting the door, blocking out noises in the environment, and keeping it up for a set period of time. That's what's going to lead to success in this era of constant distraction.
So we'll see a couple more examples here, but this is just to drive the point home. There is no such thing as multitasking. But his point about attention spans is really also important, and this idea that we think that we are, switching tasks or whatever, you are basically using extended working memory. This is why those partners of attention and memory come into play. You're using extended working memory, and that looks like multitasking, but obviously your attention is split, so you're not getting as much out of the task. So if we look at attention spans, how long can somebody pay attention? Most school classes, universities as well as high school classes, range somewhere between 40 minutes and 2 hours, sometimes 2.5 hours. I have watched people say that, yes, they have a 4-hour-long class. How does that work? Can you keep people's attention for that long? There are some things that can be shifted. We know that individual attention spans are much shorter than that. How short are they? We're going to see in a video clip that summarizes a lot of the most recent research related to how having your phone available all the time, or how people are always connected. How does that help or hurt attention spans? But I want you to listen to this video and pay attention to this idea that maybe that's not all negative. Maybe there's something positive to be got out of that. The key idea here is, how do we manage to have a class that can be 2 hours long? Well, you have to change either the person, the place, or the activity that you're doing. And so we can't change our place very much because we've got our class online, right? So either a different person has to take over and talk, either the activity has to be reshifted so that you're looking at different types of information or application. But by shifting, you're able to reset this clock and sort of extend and use your time in a more beneficial way. All of us have had this terrible experiences, I'm sure, where you've sat in a class and just feel like you're going to lose it after the first half an hour, and then you slowly nod off, because if it's just one single mode of delivery of information, you just can't pay attention for that long. Okay? So let's listen. Now I want you to pay attention to this video, and I want you to think very clearly, what is the message that she's sending as far as technology? Is technology a good thing or a bad thing, or is there a way to argue in both directions? Listen in.
Does the internet make us smarter or more distracted? Let's take a look at what the science... Oh, what was that shiny thing? Hi everyone, Julia here for D News. It seems like kids these days are spending a lot of time in front of screens. And according to research published in the journal Archives of Disease in Childhood, it's true. And what's more, these experiences are increasingly fragmented. You might pause this YouTube video to go check out Twitter, or you might text your friend while watching a movie. But while these new technologies change our experiences, is our attention becoming more fragmented as well? Research from the University of Southern California Marshall School of Business found that we consume a lot of digital media. I mean a lot. The average American receives more than 15 hours a day of digital media. Everything from YouTube videos and Netflix movies to computer games and text messages. By the age of 7, a child born today will have spent the equivalent of 1 full year watching screens, according to a study published in the journal Archives of Disease in Childhood. That's basically spending a seventh of your life on the computer or checking your texts. So what is this doing to our brains? Teachers seem to think it's nothing good. According to the Pew Research Center's Internet and American Life project, 87% of teachers think that technology creates an easily distracted generation with short attention spans. But the research isn't so conclusive. It may seem easy to assume, based on earlier studies on TV watching habits, that screen time does affect attention spans. A study published in the journal Pediatrics reports that for each hour of television watched per day at ages 1 through 3, increases the risk of attention problems such as ADHD by almost 10% by age 7. And that's what a few studies also show. Recent research from Microsoft, of all places, found that average attention span has dropped. 15 years ago, attention spans were around 12 seconds on average, now they're around 8 seconds. And some people think that's less of an attention span than what a goldfish has. But maybe this is a case of adaptation. As we're bombarded with more and more media, we're more discerning about how we consume it. Just like when we used to get yelled at for flipping channels too fast, it only takes an instant to decide if we want to watch something or not. Maybe technology changes the way we focus our attention. But some researchers caution that just because we may be allocating our attention differently as a function of the technologies we may be using, it doesn't mean that the way our attention actually can function has changed. One study published in the journal Human Performance found that young people under 30 begin to lose concentration on workplace tasks after 5 to 15 minutes. But it also suggested that the internet is both the poison and the cure. The study implies that young adults get a boost in mood and attention after browsing the web for a few minutes, then returning to a task. This wasn't the case for older adults who didn't receive the same benefits from a leisurely scroll around the web. The same poll from the Pew Research Center found that 77% of teachers think that the internet has a mostly positive impact on students' research habits. But while technology like the internet and smartphones change the way we tune into information, it literally gives us the world of knowledge at our fingertips. And I wouldn't trade that for anything.
Okay, so I'll leave this big debate open here. Does the internet make you smarter or dumber? Well, everything is still out there, because I would never blame technology on a human's ability to learn or not. We've always had technology, we've always had invasive technology, we've always thought that things would change the world, like the pencil or the printing press or television. We always thought that those things would be so drastic. But it's a different kind of technology, and how is this changing our brains? If we know that, for example, attention spans are reduced because of that, and we know then, combine that information with, for example, Posner's ideas about different attention networks, what is being lost there? If attention spans tend to be shorter, that means the alerting system is on high, right? But things like sustained attention or orienting your attention towards a specific activity is lessened. So could it be that you might resolve this by balancing out? Your brain adapts to what it does most. So instead of just having so many experiences which shorten the attention span or that heighten alerting networks, what would happen if you did things like required for every minute on a screen, you had a minute of reading, which is sustained network or for attention. So you would balance out these systems and not allow one to dominate the other. Think about that. Okay, so what did we try to do today? We looked at attention vocabulary that's in the literature. We looked a little bit at this idea of attention is necessary for learning, and that is something we're going to explore when we're together in class this coming week. And we also looked at attention in the brain. What are the neural systems that are aligned there, and some of the theories that are behind that. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop. As always, if you have any questions, go ahead and shoot me an email or put them in the discussion board. I look forward to seeing you in live class. Bye-bye.